Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. The summer of '69 burned hot and bright, a season of change that would alter the course of two young men's lives forever. Tom and Mike, best friends since childhood, stood shoulder to shoulder in the sweltering heat, their hands trembling as they held their draft cards aloft. The crowd around them chanted, voices rising in a cacophony of protest against the war that raged halfway across the world. "Ready?" Tom asked, his voice barely audible above the din. Mike nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Now or never?" In unison, they flicked their lighters, watching as the flames licked at the edges of their cards. The fire consumed the paper quickly, leaving nothing but ashes that scattered in the warm breeze. As the crowd cheered, Tom and Mike exchanged a look of grim satisfaction. They'd done it, they'd burned their bridges, but the elation was short-lived. Reality set in as they made their way back to Tom's beat-up Chevy, parked a few blocks away from the protest. They couldn't go home now. They were draft dodgers, criminals in the eyes of the law. "Canada?" Mike suggested, drumming his fingers nervously on the dashboard. Tom nodded, starting the engine. Canada. The journey north was a blur of endless highways, cheap motels, and hushed conversations. They crossed the border under the cover of darkness, their hearts pounding as they presented their fake IDs to the bored-looking customs officer. By some miracle, they made it through. For the next few years, Tom and Mike built a life for themselves in Toronto. They found work, made friends, and tried to forget about the war and the lives they'd left behind. But the past has a way of catching up, no matter how far you run. The call came on a morning. Tom's sister, her voice choked with tears, delivered the news. Their mother had passed away. Tom's world tilted on its axis. He needed to go home to say goodbye, to make peace with the family he'd abandoned. "We can't go back," Mike argued, pacing their small apartment. "We'll be arrested the moment we step foot in town." Tom sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. "I have to, Mike. She's my mom." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Mike spoke. "We'll need a disguise." And so began their desperate search for a way to return home undetected. They considered every option, from fake mustaches to elaborate prosthetics. Nothing seemed foolproof enough until they stumbled upon Mrs. Bly's hair salon. Mrs. Bly, a stout woman with a shock of purple hair, listened to their predicament with a thoughtful expression. "Boys," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against her chin, "have you considered a more drastic change?" Tom and Mike exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean?" Tom asked. Mrs. Bly's eyes twinkled mischievously. "How do you feel about dresses?" The suggestion hung in the air, outrageous and yet strangely plausible. Tom and Mike stared at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. It was crazy. It was risky. But it just might work. "All right," Tom said finally. "Let's do it." The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Mrs. Bly worked her magic, turning two scruffy young men into passable women. She taught them how to walk in heels, how to apply makeup, how to modulate their voices. Hours turned into days as they practiced, stumbling and cursing and laughing at their own reflections. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. Tom and Mike, now Tammy and Michelle, stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing themselves. Tom's sandy hair had been styled into soft waves, framing a face softened by careful contouring. He wore a modest blue dress that hugged his newly padded figure. Mike, now sporting a sleek black wig, was dressed in a flowing green sundress that complemented his olive skin. "Well," Mike said, his voice higher than usual, "I guess this is it." They drove back across the border, hearts in their throats as they presented their new IDs to the customs officer. But their fears were unfounded. The officer barely glanced at them, waving them through with a bored, "Welcome home, ladies." The funeral was a somber affair. Tom, hidden behind dark sunglasses and a black veil, stood at the back of the church, his heart breaking as he watched his family mourn. He longed to comfort them, to reveal himself, but the risk was too great. As the service ended, he slipped away, unseen and unknown. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Tom and Mike. As they prepared to return to Canada, they received an unexpected offer. Mrs. Bly's cousin, owner of a chain of hair salons in their hometown, was looking for new stylists. It was a chance to stay, to rebuild their lives in the place they'd once called home. "We can't," Mike protested. "It's too dangerous." But Tom saw the longing in his friend's eyes, the same desire to stay that burned in his own chest. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we can." And so began their new lives as Tammy and Michelle, hairstylists extraordinaire. At first, it was just a cover, a way to hide in plain sight. But as the months passed, something unexpected happened. They found they enjoyed their work, the camaraderie of the salon, the satisfaction of making people feel beautiful. They took hormones, at first to maintain their disguise, but soon because it felt right. Their bodies softened, their perspectives shifted. The lines between their old selves and new identities blurred until it was hard to remember a time when they weren't Tammy and Michelle. Years passed. The war ended. Draft dodgers were pardoned. But Tom and Mike, now truly Tammy and Michelle, found they no longer wanted to reclaim their old lives. They had built something new, something uniquely theirs. They opened their own salon, then another and another. Their chain grew, becoming a fixture in the community. They hired other transgender individuals, creating a safe space in a world that was often hostile. And somewhere along the way, they found love. Tammy met John, a kind-hearted accountant who saw past her facade to the person beneath. Michelle fell for David, a charming lawyer who loved her wit and strength. Their weddings were small, intimate affairs, attended by the family they'd chosen and the few blood relatives who had come to accept them. Now, decades later, Tammy and Michelle sat on the porch of their shared retirement home, gray-haired and wrinkled, but still unmistakably themselves. They watched as their grandsons, strapping young men in crisp military uniforms, climbed out of a shiny new car. "Grammy Tammy! Nana Michelle!" the boys called, waving excitedly. Tammy felt a familiar pang of guilt, mixed with an overwhelming sense of pride. These boys, barely men really, were so eager to serve their country. They reminded her of herself and Mike, all those years ago, before everything changed. "Do you ever regret it?" Michelle asked softly, reading her old friend's thoughts as easily as ever. Tammy considered the question, watching as their grandsons bounded up the porch steps. "No," she said finally. "We made our choice. It wasn't the right choice for everyone, but it was right for us." Michelle nodded, reaching out to squeeze Tammy's hand. "We've had a good life," she agreed. As their grandsons regaled them with tales of basic training, Tammy and Michelle exchanged a knowing glance. Their path had been unconventional, to say the least. They had run from one war only to fight battles of a different kind, battles for acceptance, for identity, for the right to simply exist as they were. But they had survived. More than that, they had thrived. They had built successful careers, found love, raised families. They had touched countless lives through their salons, offering not just beauty treatments, but a listening ear, a safe haven, a chance for others like them to be seen and accepted. Yes, there was shame in their past, the lingering guilt of having fled rather than served, but there was pride, too, in the lives they'd built, in the community they'd fostered, in the grandsons who now chose to serve with clear eyes and full hearts. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Tammy and Michelle sat back in their rocking chairs, content. Their journey had been long and strange, full of unexpected twists and turns. But as they looked at each other, at the lives they'd built, at the family gathered around them, they knew they wouldn't have had it any other way. The evening wore on, filled with laughter and stories. The grandsons, Eric and Jason, hung on every word as Tammy and Michelle recounted tales from their salon days. The quirky clients, the disastrous haircuts, the friendships forged over shared confidences and heated curling irons. "But Grammy," Eric said, his brow furrowed in confusion. "How did you and Nana Michelle meet? You never talk about that." Tammy and Michelle exchanged a look, a lifetime of shared secrets passing between them in an instant. How could they explain the truth? That they had once been young men, thrust into an impossible situation, who had made a desperate choice that altered the course of their lives forever. "Well," Tammy began, choosing her words carefully, "Michelle and I, we grew up together in a way. We've known each other for a very long time." Michelle nodded, picking up the thread. "We were different back then, scared, confused. The world wasn't as accepting as it is now. We found ourselves in a situation where we had to make a choice," Tammy continued. "A hard choice, one that not everyone would understand or agree with." The boys leaned in, captivated by this glimpse into their grandmother's mysterious past. "What kind of choice?" Jason asked. Tammy sighed, her eyes distant. "We chose to become who we truly were, even though it meant leaving behind everything we knew. It wasn't easy. We lost family, friends. We had to start over completely." "But we had each other," Michelle added, reaching out to clasp Tammy's hand. "And in the end, that was enough." Eric and Jason exchanged glances, clearly sensing there was more to the story. But they didn't press, respecting the privacy their grandmothers clearly valued. "We're proud of you, boys," Tammy said, changing the subject. "Serving your country. It's a noble thing. But remember," Michelle added, her voice serious, "there are many ways to serve, many ways to be brave. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves." The boys nodded solemnly, absorbing the weight of their grandmother's words. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, Tammy found herself lost in thought, remembering the long and winding road that had led them here. She thought of that sweltering summer day when they'd burned their draft cards, the fear and exhilaration that had coursed through their veins. She remembered the long drive to Canada, the years of exile, the constant looking over their shoulders. And then came the funeral, the desperate plan to return home in disguise, Mrs. Bly's knowing smile as she transformed them, teaching them to walk and talk and move like women. The terror of that first border crossing, certain they would be discovered at any moment. But they weren't discovered. Instead, they found a new life, a new purpose. The salon became their sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves, even if that self was different from what they had originally imagined. Tammy remembered the day she realized she no longer wanted to go back to being Tom. It had been a gradual thing, this shift in identity, but one morning as she stood before the mirror, carefully applying her makeup, she knew this was who she was meant to be. She thought of the day she told Mike, now fully embracing life as Michelle, about her decision to continue living as a woman. The relief in Michelle's eyes, the whispered confession that she felt the same way. They had started this journey as a means of escape, but somewhere along the way it had become their truth. There had been struggles, of course, the constant fear of being discovered, the pain of rejection from family members who couldn't understand, the physical and emotional challenges of transition undertaken in secret with only each other for support. But there had been joy, too, the thrill of building their salon empire, of creating a space where others like them could feel safe and accepted. The unexpected blessing of love, John and David, who had seen past their unusual circumstances to the women they truly were. And now, watching their grandsons prepare to embark on their own journeys, Tammy felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in their bravery, fear for their safety, and yes, a lingering sense of guilt for her own choices so many years ago. But as she looked at Michelle, her partner in this lifelong masquerade turned reality, She knew she wouldn't change a thing. They had made their choice all those years ago. It hadn't been the choice everyone would make, but it had been right for them. As the evening drew to a close, Eric and Jason hugged their grandmothers tightly, promising to write and call whenever they could. Tammy and Michelle waved from the porch as the boys drove away, their taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk. "Well," Michelle said, settling back into her rocking chair, "that was a close one. I thought for sure they were going to figure it out this time." Tammy nodded, a wry smile playing on her lips. "They're smart boys. I think they suspect something, even if they don't know exactly what. Do you think we should tell them?" Michelle asked, voicing the question that had hung between them for years. "The whole truth, I mean." Tammy considered this for a long moment, rocking gently as she watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Maybe someday," she said finally. "When they're older, when they can understand the complexities of it all." Michelle hummed in agreement. "It's funny, isn't it, how life turns out? If someone had told us back then when we were burning those draft cards that this is where we'd end up, we'd have thought they were crazy," Tammy finished with a chuckle. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own memories. The night air was cool and fragrant with the scent of blooming jasmine from Michelle's carefully tended garden. "You know," Tammy said suddenly, "I've been thinking, maybe we should write it all down. Our story, I mean, from the beginning." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "You mean like a book?" Tammy nodded, warming to the idea. "Why not? It could be our legacy, a way to explain everything to the boys, to our families. And who knows? Maybe it could help others who are struggling with their identity, show them that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be." Michelle considered this, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You know, that's not a bad idea. Lord knows we've got enough material for a whole series of books." They laughed together, the sound carrying out into the quiet night. As their laughter faded, Tammy reached out, taking Michelle's hand in hers. "Thank you," she said softly. Michelle squeezed her hand. "For what?" "For everything. For being there through all of it. I don't think I could have done any of this without you." Michelle's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "Right back at you, old friend." As they sat there, hand in hand, Tammy felt a sense of peace wash over her. Their journey had been long and often difficult, filled with fear and uncertainty, but it had also been a journey of discovery, of becoming. They had found themselves, found love, found a way to make a difference in the world. Yes, there were regrets, the pain they'd caused their families, the years of deception, the lingering question of what might have been if they'd made different choices. But there was pride, too, in the lives they'd built, in the people they'd become. They were Tammy and Michelle now, truly and completely. The frightened young men who had fled to Canada were gone, transformed by time and choice and the simple act of living. And as they rocked gently on their porch, watching the night deepen around them, they were at peace with who they had become. The idea of writing their story took root, growing stronger with each passing day. Tammy and Michelle spent their mornings on the porch, sipping coffee and piecing together their shared history. They laughed over half-forgotten anecdotes, shed tears over painful memories, and marveled at the twists and turns their lives had taken. As winter approached, they moved their writing sessions indoors. Their living room became a sea of notepads and old photographs, a timeline of their lives spread out across every available surface. They wrote of their childhood friendship, of the fear and confusion of the draft, of the desperate flight to Canada. They described the years of exile, the constant longing for home mixed with the terror of being caught. They wrote of Mrs. Bly and her transformative magic, of learning to walk in heels and speak in higher registers. They recounted the nerve-wracking journey back across the border, the heartbreak of attending the funeral in disguise. But they also wrote of joy, the unexpected fulfillment they found in their work at the salon, the gradual realization that their disguises had become their truths. They described the thrill of falling in love, of building families, of creating a safe space for others like them. As they wrote, they found themselves processing their experiences in new ways. Old wounds began to heal, long-buried emotions surfaced and were examined in the light of day. They cried together over the pain they'd caused their families, the years of estrangement and misunderstanding. But they also celebrated their resilience, their courage in forging a path that few had traveled before. The writing became a form of therapy, a way to make sense of their extraordinary lives. They debated how much to reveal, how to explain the complexities of gender and identity to a world that might not understand. But always, they returned to the core of their story, a tale of friendship, of survival, of becoming. As spring bloomed outside their windows, Tammy and Michelle put the finishing touches on their manuscript. They read it aloud to each other, tweaking phrases here and there, filling in gaps in their shared memory. And when they were done, they sat back, exhausted but exhilarated. "We did it," Michelle said, her voice filled with wonder. "We actually wrote our story." Tammy nodded, leafing through the pages with a sense of awe. "It's all here! Everything we've been through! Everything we've become!" They sent copies to their families first, their children, their siblings, the relatives who had drifted away over the years. The responses trickled in slowly. There was shock, confusion, anger from some quarters. But there was also understanding, forgiveness, a desire to reconnect. Eric and Jason, home on leave, sat with their grandmothers and read the manuscript cover to cover. There were tears and hugs, difficult questions and honest answers. But in the end, there was acceptance, and a deeper appreciation for the strength and courage of the women who had raised them. The book, when it was finally published, caused a stir. It was controversial, challenging, unlike anything that had come before. But it also struck a chord with readers around the world. Letters poured in from people who saw themselves in Tammy and Michelle's story, who found hope and courage in their journey. Tammy and Michelle found themselves thrust into the spotlight, invited to speak at conferences and universities, interviewed on talk shows. It was overwhelming at times, but they faced it together as they had faced everything in their lives. And through it all, they remained Tammy and Michelle, best friends, business partners, grandmothers. Their love for each other, forged in the crucible of shared experience, remained as strong as ever. As they sat on their porch one evening, watching the sun set on another day, Tammy turned to Michelle with a smile. "You know," she said, "if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing." Michelle squeezed her hand, her eyes twinkling with mischief and decades of shared memories. "Not even the part where you tripped in your heels and fell into that wedding cake?" Tammy laughed, the sound rich and full. "Okay, maybe I'd change that. But the rest, not a bit." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening sky. Their journey had been long and strange, filled with more twists and turns than they could have ever imagined. But as they looked at each other, at the lives they'd built, at the family and friends who surrounded them, they knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.